Hi and hello tractor fans, and welcome to another edition of the Real Tractor Show with me, your host Big Wheel O'Reilly, and today I'm joined by our good friend who likes to wheel around his estate on a tiny wee tractor there for cutting the grass. Gary, how you doing, mate?
Hi and hello Watch fans, and welcome to another edition of the Real Time Show with your friendly neighbourhood jeweller Alon Ben Joseph and me, your friendly neighbourhood watchmaker Rob Nuds. We are back together for another Q&A session, and today we have some interesting questions from the Real Time Network, our WhatsApp group for all of our most dedicated listeners. If you'd like to join, get in touch with us via the usual channels, either Instagram, LinkedIn, email, or via the contact form on the website www.therealtime.show, and we will add you to the group. Alon, how are you doing, mate?
I'm doing well, having fun, had an awesome week. Last week's Q&A was great fun, sparked a lot of feedback again, and I want to know how you're doing. How's your week been?
Well, it's been good. It's been busy. I played football at the weekend, which was nice, and wasn't injured for once, so that's good. The weather here is absolutely stunning, and I am looking forward to some serious watch chat today. So let's dive straight into the mailbag and see what our lovely listeners have left for us.
She's unfortunately still our only female member in the network. So ladies, if you're listening, please give Sana some backup. Sana's amazing in the network. She has the tradition now to ask every new member their Instagram handle. So shout out to Sana. You are the best. She sent a question for the mailbag. As a watch journalist, do you get to decide yourself from a selection of watches what you want to write about? Or are you assigned certain watches? In that case, what happens if you get one that you really don't like? Would you be able to write that you think it's a complete abomination? Or would you try and find just something that you like about it, while making what wouldn't be the most positive review ever? Or would you be able to just turn it down and not write it at all? Give us the backstory about how it all works. Rob, you are becoming more and more famous. You were famous, and I'm not just talking amongst your groupies and the ladies, but you recently started as well to write for Revolution Media Group.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you are not just a journalist because you write so on your LinkedIn profile, but you literally write a lot of content, which you always done, and you did, and you're really multi-pronged, multi-talented, but you actually write reviews. So please, would you mind answering this one?
So as my, I would say hero, Dan Hansis from the NFL podcast Around the NFL would say, this is how the sausage gets made. So we're looking behind the scenes into watch journalism, what actually goes on in the factory. So, Sana, this is a brilliant question because it is multifaceted and it touches on a lot of different aspects of watch media and its production. So I'm going to try and go through blow for blow. And it's a very timely question because, as Alon rightly said, I've just started writing for Revolution magazine, the US magazine specifically, but also for their digital channel. And this is similar to some jobs I've had before and very different from jobs that I've had elsewhere. So my role with Revolution at the moment, to start in the present day, is a contributor. Effectively, I will write what I am assigned. I don't have say in that. I suppose I could turn down a piece if I didn't want to write it, but I'm more than happy to take on any assignment that is put on my plate. Now, typically, I do not know how to bite my tongue, and it's been many years since I've really been required to from a professional perspective. And so even in the second article I wrote for Revolution, I believe that my editor-in-chief, Banu Chopra, who lives in Prague, excellent watch aficionado himself, and someone that if you get the chance to meet, you really should spend some time with, he was like, oh, this is a bit, scything, shall we say, let's just tone it down a little bit. And I had to remind myself that I am now not in a position that I was in terms of complete narrative freedom when I was managing editor at Fratello and really pushed the boundaries of what is acceptable honesty in watch media And obviously, because I like that kind of approach without being overtly and unnecessarily offensive, like certain commentators in the industry, we started the real-time show. So we had a network for that kind of unvarnished but reasoned opinion. I think that's how we would describe it. We don't hold back, but we also try and justify our opinions fairly and make objective points where possible. Let's look at this question specifically. So, do I get to decide from a selection of watchers what I'd like to write about? So that depends on what position you hold within the media hierarchy of the outlet for which you write. When I was at Fratello, I was the managing editor, and so I had the deciding voice on what went to whom, and I wrote about... Actually, to be honest, I tended to write about the watches that no one else wanted to write about because we had obligations not just to brand partners, but in my opinion, and this is something I hold very, very dear to my heart, we had an obligation to the industry and to the readers and to the listeners of podcasts like this to cover the news. Now, as you will notice from certain major websites, actually being a journalist is no longer their prime concern. Their prime concern is cash, really. And so you will notice that there are fewer and fewer media outlets that are tackling every new product or talking about the little guys, because they just don't generate clicks and they don't generate revenue. And that is not what some of those major players are concerned with, because they have transitioned from being a blog for the people into being a media entity in its own right and really a brand in their own right. So that's something to be aware of. So in the role as managing editor for Fratello, I would really farm out the watches to my writers, try and give the brands that I knew certain people were fond of to them. I would give difficult topics to more experienced journalists, like Lex Stolk was always my go-to when I had something a bit sensitive, because Lex has been in the industry for a long time. He's professionally trained. He knows his stuff in every way. If it was something a little bit more philosophical, I would give it to, say, Thomas Stover, who was an American journalist who I worked with briefly at Fratello. He just had a way of making a story out of nothing, basically. His writing was very interesting. So I would take the dregs in that regard, because that was my job as a leader of that team, to make sure that everything was covered and given the appropriate time. So what would happen if I got a watch that I really didn't like? So, okay, there's 2 things or 3 things that could happen here. If that watch comes from a media partner, and that is somebody with which the said media outlet has a paid relationship for whatever reason. Now, that could be paid content, it could be banner ads, it could be an ongoing watch collaboration, so on and so forth. It could just be buddy up for events. You want to keep your friends sweet and so on. So if it were that in case, many media outlets I know would simply write a positive review, or at least a neutral review if they were being truer to themselves, just to get it out there, just to give it the clicks, just to give it the exposure. I would do one of 2 things in that situation. I would either contact the partner brand and say, look, we're partners, I'm being straight up with you here, I can't write about this watch positively and be telling the truth. So if you would prefer, maybe send me XYZ watch that I selected from the catalog that I thought was a good fit, something that I could be honest about and something that would provide valuable content to our listeners. Or I would say, if you really, really want me to make this particular watch the headline, then fine. But I am going to use this as a counterpoint to better things in your collection. I am going to be positive about the bits of your collection I like and use this model as the mirror, as it were. That was just what I did. It's not something that is general practice. It's not something that I expect anybody else to do, but I thought that was the best way to retain integrity while maintaining good relations with a paying media partner. Now, when I am not required to do this, I will, as well say that something is a complete abomination. I try not to rubbish a brand entirely unless I think that a brand's whole reason for being is preposterous. And when I do think that, and when I think that it's damaging to the industry and damaging to the culture of watchmaking, I will say it. And to give a practical example, because there's no point me saying it and just leaving air out there, I was really furious about the success of Filippo Loretti, the Kickstarter brand that blew up the watchmaking industry for about 3 months. And everybody said, oh, this has disrupted the industry. It's changed luxury forever. I mean, of course it didn't. It did nothing but piggyback on the insecurities of consumers that weren't well enough informed, because unfortunately, watch media is very rarely as transparent as it needs to be to bring new people into the fold responsibly, to give them an education of what is good, at what price point, and why it's good, technically speaking, and where your subjective taste may lead you if you have a feeling for watches that maybe don't fit in the mainstream aesthetic. Okay, next part of Santa's question. Would I try and find something to like about it? Well, look, I find it a lot easier to like most people than I do to like most watches. So I always find something good about people. Very rarely, and it's happened a couple of times, and off air I'll give you some examples, but it's happened a couple of times when I've met people that have no redeeming features whatsoever. But most humans do. Most humans have a talent or a passion or an interest or a character trait, great emotional empathy, for example, or humor, or they might be incredibly good looking or well dressed or whatever. Most people have something, whether it's superficial or really deeply rooted in their personality. Humans are easy to like. Watches are less easy to like because watches, well, they don't talk back, they don't cry, and they aren't as multifaceted. They are there to do a job. And if I can't find anything to like about the watch, if I can't find anything redeeming about the brand or its message or its mission, then, you got to say it. You just got to say it. Most of the time, there is something you could say. So even if I hate a watch, like personally, I can look at it objectively and say, well, maybe, at this price point, if you like these big watches, let's say bulky watches, like Action Man watches, then maybe this is something that would provide you with a decent alternative to X, Y, Z. Maybe. I would try and step out of my own zone and look at it and say, well, I don't feel it. But, if you like that kind of thing, then go ahead. Last point that Santa raises is, would I be able to turn it down and not write about it at all? Now, obviously, at the real-time show, we can do that. We can just say, take this, go away. We're not interested. We'll try and be politer than that, but we can do that. Have I ever done that in my previous roles? Yes, I have, although quite rarely. Like I say, there are options that I tend to exhaust first. Firstly, I will contact a brand and say, give me something else. Secondly, I'll say, okay, I'm going to talk about it through the lens of this watch, but I'm going to say bad things about this and good things about other things that you do. But on occasion, I have just been so disappointed with a product, so jaded by the style of the brand communication, because that matters as well. Like, bear in mind, depending on your role, if you are brand facing, as I have been many times in my career for many different outlets, and I'm still now with the real-time show, we get contacted directly by the brand, and the arrogance that comes to your door would blow your mind. Okay, big brands, you can imagine they'd be like that. Doesn't excuse them from it. Not in my opinion. I think you should treat everybody well in the first instance, at least. There's no reason to start off on a bad foot. But even small brands, micro brands, sort of preaching to me how lucky I am to be able to cover their watch. And I get that they probably read this in like How to Build a Brand for Dummies or whatever, and they think, be confident, be direct, act as if you deserve to be there. And that's like, okay, yeah, fine. But the people that really deserve to be there, the people that really have skill, the people that really have a feeling for the other people in the industry, they're the coolest and the most laid back and the most chilled out guys you'll ever meet in life. Acting like you deserve to be there doesn't mean being a dick. It's quite the opposite. It's like, you don't have to fight anymore. When you're the real deal, you can just be yourself. You just say, oh yeah, I love watches. I'm pretty knowledgeable about watches. I've got a lot of time served in this industry and I really care. And you don't have to sort of swan up to every event in a Versace suit and carrying a Gucci handbag with your Richard Mille on the wrist. You don't have to play all those games. You can just be real. And sometimes when you get new brand owners that think that the way to like impress you is to come at you with that kind of, I don't know, missile of arrogance, they don't get a look in. No chance whatsoever. That, I hope, answers the question. It's basically where you stand in the hierarchy of the media outlet for which you're writing. And then, depending on what you're asked to cover, there are ways of dealing with it that I think are more responsible than others. Alon, you've done stuff before with like the Ace list, and you've done plenty of interviews with luminaries in the industry. How have you found it now, sort of being in a position where you have to comment critically on watches?
The problem is, I think in the watch industry, we are self-sustaining. What do I mean by that? If you need to run a media outlet, it costs a lot of money. The real-time show actually costs both Rob and I a lot of money every month. And if you want to even get to break even, you could consider sponsors, advertisers, etc. So for the record, the Real Time Show today has never been financed by anybody else but Rob and I. So we're fully independent. We thought a lot about how could we get our costs covered, forget about making profit, get our costs covered, and grow the team. I mean, David, for example, is doing this really out of his passion. And so we run this literally as volunteers. And it's a passion project. Now it's becoming so big that it's becoming a brand, and we have a lot of stakeholders expecting stuff from us, meaning listeners expect us to keep the quality high. Some want more quantity, some want less quantity, shorter episodes or less per week. But okay, that's a different story. But we have enough fuel to run at the current speed, and we can even take it a notch higher. But brands also want a lot from us. We got offered advertising, we got offered sponsorship, we got offered product placements, we got offered barter deals, we got offered advertorials, etc. Up until now, everything we did, everything we said is our personal opinion. So within ACE, as a retailer, we are independent, family owned, family run. Although brands want us to say A, if we think B, we'll say B. When we as retailers give advice to consumers, it's honest advice. If a brand says something is manufactured and we know it isn't, we'll say it's not manufactured. If a customer asks us if we personally think something is expensive and we think that it is, we'll say it. So that for me is honesty. Now, you and I, with the Real Time Show, put the pedestal very high because we called it the Real Time Show, insinuating multiple things. One is real time, so on the pulse of the industry, but we kind of also meant that we do real talks. And then at a certain point, that became our slogan, real talks about real watches with real opinions. And I guess that we accumulated a cool following and a group and a network of like-minded people that speak their mind and appreciate what we do. That being said, brands don't always like that. And especially in the luxury industry, and the watch industry belongs to the luxury industry. I'm not saying things are being made up or lied, but, and it's a bit of a Swiss mentality, is if you don't mention anything, it's not lying, right? So opaqueness, things that are not transparent. And that's not what you and I are about. So with the ACE list, initially, I would interview the brands I was working with. And then at a certain point, I would have guests on the show of brands that I don't represent. And if they wanted to script it or tell me not to ask particular things, because the concept was during COVID to do a live stream, aired real time on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And then viewers could participate with real time questions. So I could never control the questions that come in because it's real time. I didn't want to filter it. So if that was an issue for the brands, I wouldn't have them on the show. So, and I would not edit it, the episodes. And it was literally what you see is what you get. And you are like that as a brand representative, because I met you at Nomos. You were super honest. And it was straight up. What you see is what you get with you. And that's why I loved you. Nomos is rather like that. So I love Nomos. You as a journalist are maybe the purest of the pure. So what you just said was a beautiful description, and I concur, or I can underwrite it. And with the Real Time Show, we put the bar very high. So, and it puts us also in a dilemma, because where do we take it next? And I'm going to rebound this question to both Sana and the whole network that we have, the TRTS network, but also all listeners that are not in the network. Where do you want us to take it, and how should we commercialize this channel? So, and this is something that we think a lot about. And the biggest question is, how do we keep our integrity, right? So, and I guess you and I said that we never would compromise our integrity. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does, and you've raised another one that we should probably spend a little bit of time discussing openly on air without any scripting, because that's how we do these shows. We have talked about it a lot, and we have a pitch deck. We made the pitch deck before we launched the show. We've not sent it to anyone yet. And there's a reason for that, because we found ourselves a little bit uncomfortable about the idea of selling elements of the show. Now, we've had suggestions from brands, as Alan said quite rightly. We have been contacted from representatives of brands that want to sponsor episodes or send us products for review and compensate us financially for that. We have taken products in for review, but we didn't take any money because we wanted to make sure that the format was right for the show, that we felt comfortable with it, and that it was good quality content and it added value to our audience. It gave them something that they couldn't get anywhere else. And as it happens, we haven't, as Alan said, taken any cash yet. Now, we don't want to make profit, in as much as we don't want to be rolling in millions of euros, but running costs is something we would like to cover, because it's not just the cost of like Zencaster, which is the platform we record the podcast on, or Buzzsprout, which is the one that feeds it out to all of the different channels that you listen to the podcast on, or paying for our illustrations every month, because my office colleague, he does those for us, but he does those any invoices, because we can't expect everybody around us to work for free if they're not in the watch industry. It takes quite a lot of time for him to do that. And we have promotion as well. Obviously, we advertise, we boost certain posts on LinkedIn to get more followers and to widen our reach. And we'd like to increase that, because our goal is to be the biggest watchmaking podcast in the industry. I love making special edition watches with brands. I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to do that at Fratello. I was lucky enough to first work on special edition watches with you, Alon, when I was at Nomos, and we first did our De Style edition in 2017, and then the Amsterdam series began while I was with the brand, and you've continued it with aplomb after I departed. And we'd like to do that again. And my initial hope is that we are able to do this with brands for a good cause in the industry, to feed back positively into the industry. Now, let's say, for example, we work with brand X and we sell a watch limited to like 50 pieces, and there's a big lot of money coming in from that project. Now, where would that money go? We don't know the answer to that yet, but normally a retailer would take their margin, which would be significant. You know, it would be around 30 to 40%, depending on the agreement with the brand. Now, we wouldn't want to take anywhere near that kind of money for ourselves, because that's just too much. And then we sort of find ourselves in the same situation as some of our media peers who are trying to walk that line between a media platform with integrity and a commercial enterprise. What we would like to do, I think, is probably take a portion of it to cover the costs and to increase the promotion, not just of the podcast, but of that project. But the majority of the money that would normally go to the retailer should, in our minds, go to a good cause. Now, this could be anything really that is relevant to the furtherance of the watchmaking craft, or to an initiative that brings people from more diverse backgrounds into the industry. And we have ideas. We're always open to new ideas. If you know of, say, an academic institution that furthers watchmaking, like the British Horological Institute or the Museum of Timekeeping or the Horological Society of New York, for example, or the Museum of Watchmaking in Le Chaux de France, you know, if you know of anything that you think might benefit from something like that, then let us know, because we're interested. I also thought recently it might be very, very interesting to pursue with an established brand, and this would take a very particular kind of brand to agree to this, to actually raise money to help other brands get off the ground. Now, this sounds a bit crazy that one brand would do a project to help another brand do that, but I was recently talking to some of my friends in Dresden who are starting their own company, and they're doing everything by hand with the movements, and they just need this lathe that they can't afford to buy at this moment, but they need this lathe to do the next step of finishing that they want for their watches. And I thought, you know what, wouldn't it be interesting if a brand, an established brand, agreed that as part of our cut of any project we did together, we were actually permitted to donate and openly communicate the fact that we donated money to another fledgling brand to enable them to get off the ground? Because to me, Watchmaking has given me everything I could have hoped for in my career. I've been very, very, very lucky. I've worked very hard in the 20 years that I've been at it, but to sit here now, to be able to talk to these listeners that are so engaged with the content we're putting out that they've joined a private group and they chat to us on a daily basis is just the greatest privilege of my life, and such a wonderful thing, something I could never have imagined would have been possible when I was taking my first steps in customer-facing retail back in 2003. I want this to perpetuate. I want other people to have the career trajectory that I've had. I want people to know that there are individuals within the industry that aren't just out entirely for themselves. Do we want to put food on the table? Yeah. Do we want to keep running the real-time show and not cripple ourselves financially as a result? Of course we do. But can we do something that is open and honest and creative and collaborative that doesn't sacrifice our integrity? And I, maybe naively, and ask me in 2 years, we'll see if I stick by this, but maybe naively, I believe that we can. And I believe that if we work with the right brands, if we work with the brands that value the type of content we're putting out there, not a single one of them would try and bind our voices. No one would try and suppress anything we have to say. Nobody, even a brand. So a couple of episodes ago, I might have been slightly derisive towards a particular classic from Patek Philippe. Even Patek Philippe should look at this podcast and go, you know what? Those guys say it how it is. And our watches are good enough and our brand is established enough to weather the fair criticism of two watch aficionados, because that criticism that I directed towards the Aquanaut is not blanket criticism towards the brand of Patek Philippe at all. It's just my personal opinion, but it's unvarnished, it's unfettered, it's unshackled. And that is the important thing about the real-time show. If we can maintain that, a brand that is confident in itself and its output should be confident in being a partner with a real-time show. So we'll see how it develops. And like I say, ask me in a couple of years and see if I'm still saying the same thing. And I really hope I will be, because, you know, for the last 20 years, I've been banging the same drum, and so far it's gone all right. But please, as Alan says, if you have ideas, get in contact with us. We are always open to creative suggestions. We are welcoming of new ideas, new blood to the industry, and new blood to the network. So get involved if you don't mind. Right. Thanks, Sana. That was a good one. Went on a bit because obviously I babble on like a maniac sometimes when I get going. Let's move on to a question from our good friend Sylvain Berneron, a former guest on the show. And this one I'm going to put to you, Alon, because I know that this is a topic that you really, 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 really want to dig your teeth into. And that is, very simply, which cases do you reckon Hesalite still has a place in modern watchmaking?
Thank you, Sylvain. And congratulations on the tremendous success that you have with your own brand. And thank you so much for your extremely passionate feedback in the Real-Time Show Network. And thank you for this question. So I personally love Hesalite glasses on watches. So the covering of the watch case. The first and foremost reason is the look of it. You can't emulate it with sapphire because the way it curves and the reflection it gives. Now, a lot of watches are made to emulate that sapphire crystal. The sapphire crystal emulates the Hesalite, sorry. And the best example for those of you that might not know what I'm talking about is the Omega Speedmaster Moonwatch Professional. The original was plexi. The funny thing is everything used to be plexi because they simply couldn't make anything else. And then we got mineral glasses and sapphire crystals. They're all synthetic bulls that are produced like lab-grown diamonds. They lab-grown sapphire, make it transparent. And sapphire is hardness 9 on the scale of 10, where diamond is 10. And it's used because it's rather scratch resistant on the surface. Doesn't mean it doesn't break. So when the Moon watch was being produced, they kept on making them with Hesalite glass because although plastic scratches rather easily, it doesn't shatter in 1,000 pieces like glass does. And sapphire also creates splinters and shatters, because they said in space your watch needs to keep on ticking, working, so you have the risk of glass going into your movement or getting stuck in between your hands, etc. So today, obviously, none of us are, going to space for the time being, although that's becoming available now for space tourism. The most sold Speedmaster is still with Hesalite. So why? You either have those buyers that want it to be as original as possible. And why did Omega even make sapphire versions, exact same watch? So we nicknamed these watches either Sexy Plexi. So the top is plexi, the back is closed, like the original watch. And then Omega at a certain point, I believe in the 80s, made a sapphire version, and they use an open case back. And that's called the double sapphire. So the majority that buys sapphire is either neurotic or has OCD tendencies because they simply don't like scratches. It can help in water resistance to use sapphire versus plexi. Or people simply want a see-through case, so you're forced to buy a sapphire watch. So there are three types of buyers that buy the sapphire Omega Speedmaster Moonwatch. About a year and a half ago, they launched the upgraded version with a 3861 caliber. And then suddenly Omega made a visual difference in the watches. So very quickly, how can you spot the difference if you see somebody running around with a new Speedy? If it's a full satin metal bracelet and the Omega logo is drawn on the dial with white, it's a Sexy Plexi. If you'll see an applied Omega logo in stainless steel or white gold, I need to check that, and the mid links of the bracelet are polished, then it's a double sapphire. So it's the first time they made a visual differentiation. Now, for me, I do have a few Speedies with sapphire, because if they made limited editions and it's a sapphire, you simply don't have a choice. But I actually own the 3861 in both versions because I wanted the applied logo. I wanted the full matte bracelet. You technically couldn't buy them separately and mix it up. But I'm kind of a Speedy collector, so I had to scratch that itch. But I love vintage watches and I love Plexi because the vibe and the nostalgia it has. And I even got thrown off that Hakim and Kadir with Elka, with his watch, made a chamfered sapphire glass that really emulates Plexi. And that really triggered me. So you'll see brands are pushing that. And I'm actually very curious to hear from our listeners why they love Plexi, because more and more watches are still being produced with Plexi, but it's usually the vintage inspired or the retro inspired. And to give you another example, one of my recent purchases after the Ulrich was a Aaron Type 20 from Tom van Billik. I heard that he is moving on to making all the future batches of his Type 20 Aaron watches with sapphire. And the first generation was a Plexi. So I'm lucky enough to buy one of the last versions with Plexi. And I asked myself why when Sylvain posted this question. And I guess because it gives me that old school vibe, right? But when I asked him why he made that switch or why he doesn't follow the Omega strategy of doing both, he simply said the biggest demand is for sapphire. And collectors don't mind because they already have a modern caliber. It's never a one-on-one replica. And since that's the case, they want sapphire crystals. So I hope this answers your question, Sylvain. I'm very curious to hear your views, Rob, and what your personal preferences are between the two.
Very good question from Sylvain, and thanks for kicking it over to me. I'm kind of looking forward to this one. I'm a little unsure as to where to start. Maybe just for anyone that doesn't know, if we didn't introduce it well enough at the top. So Hesalite is like an industry term given to plexiglass, a specific type of plexiglass. I think it was kind of a brand name at the time when it was first produced, and it's become like a catch-all term for plastic crystal. As Alon said, by complete chance, actually, the Moonwatch was chosen, or one of the reasons why it was chosen was because it had this plexiglass which didn't shatter upon impact with space dust or fast-moving space dust, which I think is what they were concerned about. It would scratch up, but it would keep on running, and it was very secure. What Omega did by releasing both models was very interesting because they did a good job of really kind of giving people options and two quite different looking watches that followed the same design codes. But of course, you're going to get people complaining, and I maybe was one of those. I wanted the Hesalite crystal, but I also wanted the applied logo. So I've got a 1998 Omega Speedmaster Broad Arrow replica, and that has a Hesalite crystal and it has an applied logo. And for me, it's like the perfect balance of all things. It's got a refined dial with this beautiful vintage visage. Now, the look of Hesalite is one of the most important things. It is warmer. It provides this more engaging viewing experience. It's much less like a tool. It's much less technical, and it's much more like an emotional object, which seems at odds with the reason why Omega picked the Moonwatch to do the job that it ultimately did. But that's just a coincidence. As we know, the Speedmaster was not designed for space. It was designed as a racing chronograph, and it simply was the best of really a bad bunch when assessed for viability for space travel. Now, that warmth, should I say, falling into that ness suffix trap that people do these days. My father will be most disappointed in me. That warmness has another benefit, and Sylvain pointed this out. He said that the thing with sapphire is it always has this milky edge around the outside of it. Around the outer edge, it goes to this creamy white fade as it meets the case. And that's a very good point. Hesalite doesn't have this. It does bend reflections and the view of a dial a little bit more because of its generally more bubbly nature, but it doesn't have this milky edge. And I countered Sylvain's point with something that I'd learned very recently from an upcoming guest, Martin Clocker of Sherpa, which is basically the old Enocar Sherpa watches brought back to life under a new brand name that takes the model name and puts it front and center. And what Martin has done to combat this, because he wanted a sapphire crystal for the water resistance, but he didn't want to lose the Hesalite look. He went for basically a double dome sapphire, but on the outer edge, on the underside of the crystal, he printed a metallized black ring. And what this does is it eliminates the milkiness completely, and it's a very sharp appearance. If you've not seen these, Google Sherpa watches. You'll hear more about them when Martin comes on the show in a week or two. And it's really, really cool, a clever workaround that sort of achieves the best of both worlds. Now, the question from Sylvain actually came about because I was talking about my L'Aventure automobile, which is the first L'Aventure watch that I bought that had a plexiglass. I bought the first two L'Aventures, the Marine and the Submarine, which were the only two to have sapphire. Starting with the third model, the Transatlantique, the GMT, Clement, the owner of L'Aventure, the one-man band behind the brand, decided to go for plexiglass. I think for the Transatlantique, because he was using plexiglass for the bezel insert to recall Bakelite, the material used in the earliest GMT masters from Rolex, which people loved, but it was not very durable at all and had the habit of discoloring and cracking very easily under exposure to UV light and just through general wear. So he decided to go all plexi on that surface. And then with his follow-up to that, he released the Marine 2, which was a solid gold dial version of the Marine 1. But instead of the sapphire crystal that the Marine 1 had, he put this plexi on there and created arguably one of the most beautiful watches on the wrist in the last 20 years. And it was a very popular piece, and a piece that I wish I'd bought into at the time, but stupidly slept on. Now, I bought back into the brand with a L'Aventure automobile chronograph, and that does have a plexi. And I was not complaining about the Plexi because I love the aesthetic and I think it suits the watch very well. But I was saying, if it had a sapphire similar to the Submarine and the Marine Sapphire, which was a nice bubble sapphire, so proportionally similar to the Plexi, it would have been a real Daytona killer, is how I described it. Because that watch, the automobile, is a bit like a Nautilus Daytona mashup in a beautiful green and cream colorway. And it does everything that you really want those watches to do, but it doesn't have that sapphire crystal. So from a daily wear perspective, perhaps it's not suitable. Hesalite or Plexi, they have a hardness on the Mohs scale that we referenced before of between 1 and 2. So in comparison to Corundum or Sapphire, as we're calling it, very, very low and easy to scratch. But you can actually refinish or polish most surface scratches out of Plexis yourself. There is a product made called Polywatch, which is this white cream that you can put on the crystal of your watch and rub with a soft cloth, and it will remove most surface scratches and scuffs. Not deep gouges, but it will reduce their appearance over time if you use it regularly. Interestingly enough, for any of our thriftier listeners, you can actually do the same thing with toothpaste. I'm being serious here. So like a sort of regular Colgate toothpaste, just a white one with fluoride in it, but not with the big crystals in it. Don't get one of those like whitening toothpastes that's supposed to blast every stain off your teeth. Just go for like a very smooth, very traditional toothpaste, and you can do that with a polishing cloth. I have a few polishing cloths that I use exclusively for Perspex refinishing because I have a lot of old vintage watches with Perspex in there. So there's a little tip for you if you're looking to save a bit of cash or use something around the house to do the same job. What do I think about Hesalite? I think it definitely has a place. I think that it's enjoying a real renaissance because vintage watches have been popular for a long time for good reasons, and that is for their aesthetics, and for bad reasons because people want to invest in something they think is going to appreciate. As we've seen in recent times with the Omega Speedmaster scandal at auction that we covered a few episodes back, you can never really be sure what you're buying with a vintage watch, and a lot of people are frustrated with that because they want the styles of those watches, but they don't want the possibility of picking up something that is a Frankenwatch or is just in really bad nick because of its existence, because it's been around for a long time. So what we have now in this era is a perfect fusion, really, of modern watches being designed with old school materials that are far, far better than they were in those days, far less prone to cracking, far better machined, able to be made in more adventurous shapes, as we'll see in the near future, coming from some up-and-coming brands that are experimenting with Plexi in hitherto unseen ways. So there's a place for it. I think that it isn't necessary for every watch to have both options. I think that a designer should make that decision in the design process, what it is that they want to communicate with the watch. Do they want it to be a tool primarily, or do they want it to be an emotional object? And I guess I will say one last thing, and that is in watchmaking, we know that better is not always better. So sapphire is a better material, materially speaking, for the job at hand, but it is not better in every single way. It does not have the same emotional resonance that Hesalite can have. And it's the same question when you talk about anodized aluminium bezel inserts versus ceramic bezel inserts, for example. So I think keep that in mind. Know why you're buying a watch, know what you want out of it, and trust the designer to have made the decision based on the message they're trying to communicate with that product. That's my last word on that subject. Alon, do you have anything else to add, or should we move on to another, possibly our final question for today?
No, and thank you for that. And I'm very, very curious for our interview with Martin Klocke. I've been following Sherpa for quite some time and really speaks to me. And yeah, I'm a sucker for those vintage watches, which we've discussed in length on the show. So yeah, let's get on to the next one. And it's a rather monologous episode. We apologize for that, but sorry, we're too passionate, guys. So next and last question is from Keith Martin. And he sent this question over to us in the network. And he asks, and I'm going to let you go first, Rob. One question inspired by the latest discussion on waiting lists. Could you share insights about, and from small independents, about what makes up their time to delivery. I'm thinking personally about my ARC 2 coming to life. What's happening in those months? Is it case and handmaking? Or movement ordering? Or is it simply the watchmaker getting through an assembly backlog of orders? Or do some brands artificially extend times for credibility?
I'm going to put the monologue hat on a little bit. You can jump in and tell me to shut up if you're bored of my voice. That's fine. I know we've been a bit full on today, but like you say, we're passionate guys, and this is an answer that I can answer personally because Keith and I have been liaising about his ARC 2. That's from Arcanaut. He has placed an order for a Fordite dialed watch, and me and the team from Arcanaut are currently in the process of delivering that watch to Keith. Now, we told Keith it would be a few months before the delivery, and being a generous chap, he was more than happy to wait for that because he understands the unique nature of every Fordite dial that we're creating and also the struggles that small brands face. In fact, he understands them very implicitly by the framing of his question because he ticks many of the boxes. I will go through those points and answer them independently. So, he says, is it case and hand making? I'll say this. Yes, with Arcanaut, we use an external case manufacturer in Denmark. That case manufacturer is actually primarily concerned with making components for the hearing aid industry, which is a massive revenue generator for the Danish economy and something for which that nation is renowned around the world. We chose to work with them because when we went to the Swiss manufacturing companies that you would expect us to use, they gave us an incredible price for the manufacture of the unusual rhomboid or square-shaped crown that Arcanaut cases have, because they were concerned that they wouldn't be able to secure the 100-meter water resistance that remarkably we were able to offer thanks to a double gasketed crown tube. And so we went to an industry that is very used to working with far tighter tolerances than watchmaking, and they said they could definitely do it. However, because they are very busy, and because at the time, at least when Keith's order was placed, we weren't able to put in enormous orders for cases, which would have bumped us up the priority list, we have to wait until they're able to turn their machines over to us. The hands are laser cut in Denmark, but then they are sent to Switzerland to be loom tipped by RC Tritech. So the creators of Super Luminova themselves actually loom our hands and, where necessary, our dials. So that doesn't create a huge backlog in time from the hands perspective. They're pretty quick. They can generally turn those things around in a couple of weeks. But depending on where that order process falls within the overall construction process, it can delay us a little bit further. Keith doesn't mention the dial, but in our case, because all of the dials are handmade at Arcanaut, they do take some time to create. Of course, Keith picked his dial that had already been made, so its creation itself isn't slowing down the order, but we do have to case it all up and then put it through extreme testing to make sure that the Fordite, which for those of you that don't know is a material created by the overspray of car paint in car manufacturing plants in America, it's hardened over years, and so although it is not an organic material, it does have the tendency to behave a little bit like it. So we like to put it through extreme temperature testing and UV exposure, UV bombardment, actually, to make sure that it will survive life on the wrist. So that takes a bit of time after the case has all been assembled and everything's there. And if we notice at that point there's any QC failures, like visual QC failures, we have to disassemble and sometimes even redress the dials and revarnish them for the final touch to make sure they're ready to go out. Now, his next point is movement ordering, and that is a massive, massive bottleneck for us. So we, at the moment at Arcanaut, use Soprod A10s, which I think has just been renamed something like the M2, but don't quote me on that. The Soprod A10 is just a standard ETA 2824 clone, basically, and it's very popular because of its higher level of finishing. With microbrands that can't get on ETA's books or buy ETA movements at a reasonable price, but because we do not buy them from Soprod, we buy them from a middleman, they also have to wait to receive their mass bulk orders from the manufacturer directly. Case in point, we placed the last order for our movements. We ordered 200 movements, and that was, I think, in February that we ordered those, and the delivery date is November. Now, we do have some movements left in stock, and I think that Keith's will probably be assembled from one of the movements we have in stock, hopefully, touch wood. But yeah, obviously, people that placed their order soon after Keith would have been in the situation where we say, look, nothing is going to be ready for delivery till November because we simply don't have the components. We sold a lot more pieces than we were ever expecting to sell in the last few months because we've been out in the media a little bit more and people are getting to know the brand Arcanaut and they're very interested in the case shape. So we are telling people quite transparently when their watches are likely to be delivered and why it's going to take so long. Last point. Is it simply the watchmaker getting through assembly backlog of orders? Yes, it is also that. We work with one watchmaker in Copenhagen. He has his own shop at the moment and he takes orders from anybody passing by on the street with their watch that needs servicing or refinishing. And sometimes he has big, long lists of projects he has to achieve before he can get onto the assembly of our pieces. We hope in the near future that we'll be able to corral his time a little bit more when we have a big bulk of orders to work through, and we can say to him, look, mate, we need you basically working full-time on Arcanaut assembly for the next 2 to 3 months, or we might start bringing some of that assembly in-house, and I might be doing it myself because we're fitting out our location in Copenhagen with all of the necessary tools for me to assemble watches myself, and I can do that if it is necessary. But obviously, we'd much rather have like a dedicated watchmaker doing that all the time and not the head of brand development. That's me sitting there putting hands on watches and casing them up for QC. Last question. Do some brands artificially extend times for credibility? Well, we certainly don't, mate. We're desperately trying to get everything out as fast as we possibly can and supply our 2 retailers. We have one in California, that's Collective Horology, that I'm sure you'll have heard of, and also INDP Watches in Stockholm in Sweden. So we're trying to get it turned around as quickly as possible so we can keep our eyes focused on the future of the brand and not keep our valued customers waiting longer than is absolutely necessary. But I have to say, there are some brands that maybe are more willing these days to stick an extra month or 2 onto their waiting times, not just for credibility, but because of the practices of the bigger brands, the major brands that do keep you waiting for years. It's more accepted now. But I think probably for brands sort of our size, it's just a failsafe because we all know that stuff is going to pop up and cause us delays that we didn't foresee. We might have QC issues that might have set us right back to stage 1 of the process. So regrettably, yes, is the answer to your last question. I think some brands do it a little bit to extend, to increase the credibility and the FOMO of the piece. But I would hope that on more accessible levels and more independent levels, brands would not do that. To the most obvious example of a brand, an independent brand, a credible brand, a transparent brand with massive delays, we can look to Chapek. And we know that a lot of their problems were caused by, firstly, an unexpected explosion of interest in the brand following the release and success of the Chapek Antarctique. And secondly, because a lot of that interest occurred right at the start of the pandemic, and throughout the pandemic, a lot of their suppliers, manufacturers with whom the brand openly works, because Chapek is a conglomeration of friends. It always has been. They never pretended to do it all in-house. A lot of their supply chains were disrupted because those manufacturers were facing extreme bottlenecks to supply not just Chapek, but all the other brands that they partner with. So, Alon, your turn.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'll do it in reversed order. So, do brands artificially extend times for credibility? Honestly, I'm taking the soft side on this, okay? I hardly know them because in the end, they're all commercial enterprises. And if they're not capped in capacity, which some and most are, they need to get the products out. They need to get the sales in. So there are a lot of supply chain problems. And this was even before COVID. COVID turned everything upside down and we're still recovering. Brands are now pushing out more inventory. They're getting back on track, but they're not on track. Obviously, there's a discrepancy between demand and supply. So that creates the frustration. I guess brands, and mostly the 3 most wanted brands, which are Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Rolex, are being blamed of this, but they're at their max of production capacity. So they're not producing less on purpose. what they are doing is, if production is capped, obviously they want to make more precious watches because technically labor and production capacity is the same, and they can create higher sales tickets and therefore create more profit. That obviously is being done. What also creates a lot of frustration is the distribution of the watches. Who gets allocated what? But if we dissect the question correctly and our brands artificially extending time, that I don't know so much. Now, what creates these bottlenecks? I guess Rob dealt with all of them. At Ace, we're doing more and more collabs, and deadlines are very difficult to maintain. On average, if it's being produced fully in Switzerland, you can't get a watch out within 9 months, right, Rob? There's hardly anybody who can do turnaround time of less than 9 months. Am I correct to say that?
I reckon that's fair enough these days. Yeah, there's probably one or two exceptions, but that's kind of the going rate.
That's considered quick, right? So if everything is on track, we have a cool collab coming in September. We authorized at the end of December, beginning January. We simply can't speed it up, and it's the combination of all these little factors. And as Rob said, it's mostly the supply chain of the supplies of the spare parts. So you're as strong as your weakest link. If one lags, it lags the whole project. And there is still a lot of manual labor there, yeah. And there's a lack of watchmakers. So it's basically a perfect storm. So I want to take a more positive spin on this. I guess it's more out of their hands, and the combination of huge surge in demand plus the problems COVID created, that created a bigger delta. And it might seem that brands extend times on purpose, but that's really, I don't think it. Let's take Argon. We discussed Argon last week. Trust me, Argon is not going to delay times to create more credibility. They want the products out so they can get the cash in. Although all the backers vouch to buy one, you still need to supply, right? Otherwise, you don't have a sale. So those are my 2 cents.
Nicely said, and a positive note on which to end. Thanks again to the members of the network that submitted those questions. If you'd like to join, get in touch with us via one of the usual channels, and we'll add you to the real-time network on WhatsApp so you can be part of the fastest growing and I would say most passionate community in watchmaking today. So those usual channels are either Instagram, I'm there at Rob Nuds, ROBNUDDS. You can find Alon at ALONBENJOSEPH, or you can contact us via our emails, either Rob or Alon at therealtime.show, or via the contact form on the website, www.therealtime.show. Please like, follow, share, subscribe, send it to your buddies. Until next time, stay safe and keep on ticking.